Welcome to the podcast from Gateway Baptist Church. You're listening to a message from our Mackenzie campus. Find us at gatewaybaptist.com.au if you'd like to connect with us as we seek to change lives by following Jesus in our community, our nation, and our world.
Good morning, everybody, and happy Mother's Day to all our mothers out there. I hope that by the time my kids wake up at lunchtime that I too will get a happy Mother's Day from them. Don't usually see them these days before lunchtime, but they're not here already, are they? No, didn't think they'd make it. That's all good. Well, welcome to church this morning. This morning we're going to continue on in our series that we started a few weeks ago, looking at legends of the faith as we see them in Hebrews 11. And something in us, I think something in all of us wants to be seen as a legend. Something in all of us want to have a legend that we look up to and we aspire to. Growing up, my mum was the legend that I looked up to, appropriate for Mother's Day. But she couldn't do any wrong in my 10-year-old eyes. She looked after me, she fed me, she cared for me, she drove me to school, she did everything for me that I needed her to. She was my safe place. My mum was a legend. In fact, when I preached my very first sermon up here at Gateway, she got on a plane from Sydney and flew up here just so that she could be here and cheer me on for my very first sermon. My mum, to me, is a legend, and I recognise the blessing that it is for me today to get to acknowledge and thank my mum and celebrate her because it's Mother's Day. And it's also a privilege to me to get to be celebrated as a mum of 4 beautiful children. And hopefully today you get to celebrate your mums or be celebrated if you are a mum. But unfortunately, I also recognise that not all of us have earthly mums like mine. Not all of us look up to our mothers as legends. In fact, my mum, from a very early age, was abandoned to the foster system. She grew up in multiple foster homes, and thankfully one of those foster homes led her to the Lord. But my mum certainly didn't look up to her mother as a legend. And so I want to acknowledge that I know for some of you today does hold some pain. But today I also want to acknowledge some very special people in my life. I want to acknowledge and celebrate some of my spiritual mums. Obviously, they're women that haven't given birth to me, but I hope that each of you have a spiritual mum or a spiritual dad in your life. I've always valued a mentor in my life from a very young age, somebody that has helped me to grow up in the Lord. And they've been a very valuable part of my life. And I just want to acknowledge 3 special women this morning that have played an important role in my life over the years of being here in Queensland. Just before we left Sydney, probably I'm looking at about 16 years ago, one of the pastors from our church in Sydney said to me, "I think you really need to get in touch with this lady named Helen Bates. I think she would be an amazing mentor for you." Now, back in Sydney, I knew of Helen because she worked at a church not far from us, but I had never really met her or got to know her. So as a young person, there was no way I was going to cold call Helen Bates and say, "You don't know me, but would you be my mentor?" Lo and behold, about 18 months later, we moved to Brisbane, and guess who is already on staff here at Gateway Baptist Church but Helen Bates. And I knew in that moment that it was a divine appointment for me, so I got up the courage to ask Helen to mentor me in my role as a pastor's wife and just as a woman wanting to grow in my faith. Helen, I wonder if you could stand for me just so people can see you, and some people might not know who Helen is. She is on staff here, but Helen, I want to acknowledge this morning the incredible role that you've played in my life for the last 14 years. I am truly incredibly blessed by everything that you've done for me, the way you've championed me, the words of encouragement that you've spoken into my life. Sometimes it's been a nudge in the other direction or some kind words to help me to grow or do something differently. Helen now is also my work mentor as women's pastor. So Helen, this morning I just want to say a massive thank you, because I know that I've grown incredibly in my faith because of the input that you've had in my life. Would you thank Helen for me this morning? Perhaps somewhat less known to many of you, Meryl Mackay, I wonder if you would stand for me. Meryl has been a more recent mentor for me. Meryl, I love our chats. I love when we get together and you allow me just to pour my heart out, my love for women, my love for ministry, and out of your many years of experience in ministry yourself, you have spoken such value and truth. You've encouraged me. I love your smile. I love whenever I'm speaking at Thrive or in church, I can look to you and I feel encouraged and I feel spurred on, because she's always got this beautiful smile on her face. But the words that you speak into me, I know that over the last few years you've helped me to grow in my faith, grow as a woman of God, and grow in ministry. So I really want to thank you this morning for the value that you've put on my life. Would you thank Meryl for me? It's pretty awesome up here to get the privilege of pointing out a few people. I understand it is a privilege. Joan Nielsen, would you stand? Last but certainly not least, Joan, I love the way that you champion the younger generation. I love that an 80-something-year-old woman still turns up to women's retreat because she loves seeing what God is doing. She loves blessing and speaking value into the women of all generations. Joan, I love the encouragement that you give to me. I love the prophetic words you speak over me, and I love getting your emails of encouragement. And I know that for many women over many generations in many churches, you have truly blessed them. You are a legend of the faith, and you are an incredible spiritual mother to many women. So thank you, Joan. Would you bless Joan this morning? I really do hope and pray that you all have a Helen, a Meryl, or a Joan in your life. We have a fantastic mentoring program here at Gateway, and I want to encourage you, if you don't have a spiritual mum or a dad, get online, sign up. They are the best thing for your spiritual growth. I really want to encourage you to do that. As I read through Hebrews 11 this morning, as we look at this series of legends of the faith, I'm actually really encouraged this Mother's Day to see Sarah's name on the list, on the Hebrew Hall of Fame, as a legend. She's a champion of the faith. And here she appears in Hebrews 11, verse 11. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead. That stops me every time. Does nobody else find that funny? I can't imagine being labelled in the Bible for all of eternity to be as good as dead. But from him as good as dead came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. Why am I encouraged to see Sarah's name here? As we read Sarah's story, which we're going to do in just a little while, I'm encouraged because we will see that Sarah did so many things wrong, but she's still on the list. Not because she had it all together, not because her faith in God was so unwavering, and not because she finally got it all together and was the perfect epitome of a godly woman with godly character. She was not the perfect Proverbs 31 woman. I find Sarah really encouraging on this list because she's a woman who was quite ordinary, but God chose her to play an incredibly significant role in his plan of redemption. She didn't have it all together. She made monumental mistakes. She even laughed at the promise that God gave her that she would bear a child because it seemed so impossible to her. But here is a completely ordinary and fallible woman. But God chose her anyway to be the mother of a great nation, a nation that would one day herald in the Saviour of the world. And I reckon if God can choose an ordinary, fallible woman like Sarah, he can choose someone like me. If God can use an ordinary, fallible woman like Sarah, he can use someone like you. This ordinary woman is declared by the writer of Hebrews as faithful. This story teaches us so much about the promises of God and his character. First of all, we can see that when God makes a promise, his promises are not dependent on our circumstances. You see, life didn't go as Sarah expected it to. Like many of us women, Sarah would have grown up expecting to get married, have children, populate the earth. That's what the custom was in that time. She would have had all these hopes and dreams that she carried in her heart. But Genesis 11 tells us that Sarah was barren. And by the time God makes a promise to Abraham that Sarah would have a baby, she's lived with this disappointment of her circumstances for many, many years. And she's no doubt given up the dream and the hope that she would one day have children. I mean, she's old. Both Sarah and Abraham, at one point or another, laugh at God when he tells them that she's going to have a baby. I mean, personally, if God told me right now I was going to have a baby, let alone when I'm 90, I would not be laughing. You would find me rocking in a corner somewhere. But Abraham and Sarah laugh at God. We see in Genesis 17, here's part of the story. God also said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah." Now, out of curiosity, I looked this up because I think that's like one letter difference, an I to an H. Why has God done that? But when I looked it up, I discovered that in Hebrew, Sarai means quarrelsome, and Sarah means princess. So with one letter change, Sarah goes from being a pain in the neck to being a princess. But I love that that's what God does. He takes ordinary, flawed people like you and me, who are pains in the neck, and he puts a crown on our head, and he speaks incredible blessing and promise over us. And that's what he did for Abraham and Sarah. He said, "I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of people will come from her." Abraham fell face down. He laughed. Who dares laugh at God and his promises? He laughed and he said to himself, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, "If only Ishmael might live under your blessing." Then God said, "Yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him." You see, life certainly hadn't gone the way that Sarah expected or hoped that it would, and there was nothing that she could do about it. She was an ordinary woman living with the disappointment of circumstances that were beyond her control, just like many of us do. And God goes and makes a promise that is so far removed from her current circumstances that even Abraham laughs at God. It just doesn't make sense. The great news this morning is that God's promise doesn't depend on our circumstances, but it totally depends on Him and His character. I want to introduce you to a gorgeous friend of mine named Savan. You might know her from an earlier portrait you might have seen made out of, actually it looked more like somebody vomited on your cake. I'm really sorry.
3 eyes.
Yeah, they did a great job. So some of you might know Sav from earlier. Some of you might know that she's our GMS coordinator, our Gateway Ministry School coordinator here at Gateway. And some of you, this might be the first time that you're meeting Sav. What a privilege for you this morning. Sav, you have an incredible story of promise that God has spoken over you for many years. But tell us a little bit about your circumstances growing up and some of those promises that God spoke to you.
Good morning. So I have been living in Australia for the last 30 years. My family and I had been refugees and escaped the Pol Pot genocide in the 70s from Cambodia. And I grew up living in a refugee camp in Thailand. I was raised by a single mum. I came to Australia when I was 11, turning 12, and for most of you probably didn't know this about me, that was probably my first time, not only in a foreign country, but also learning a whole new language, but also my first time learning how to read and write. And that's a little bit difficult at the time, and because a lot of our formative years I didn't really have, because I didn't have those opportunities growing up in a refugee camp. And so, but considering I did incredibly well, I was on track to get an OP1 by the end of year 12.
Impressive.
I went to Brisbane State High. I'm from an Asian family, so there's a lot of pressure. Yes, I know, it's astounding. I didn't
flawed right there. Yeah, keep going, sorry.
But for me, halfway through grade 12, I just overcome with so much anxiety and from the expectations that I had on my life. I had my family who were saying things to me like, well, look at you, like you came from nothing pretty much, being given such a great opportunity. You need to finish this thing no matter how you're feeling, because you need to continue on. And that was really hard. I had expectations on myself, obviously. I think you have self-drive in order to do well at school. But more than that, I think I just fell apart. My body, my mind couldn't cope anymore, because it was just so much for me to live up, not only to finish well for year 12, but also to live up to the expectations of my mum and my family, who my cousins are all right now they're all like neuroscientists and pharmacists and dentists and, incredible people. And I didn't have that going for my future. And so I left before I could finish year 12. That was my decision to make. And so I probably spent the next 12 months or more just in search for what is the purpose and the meaning for my life, and not really knowing where to go. If you haven't completed year 12, it's kind of like, do I go back to school and do that, or do I just wait and see? So I waited, but I did love God. I did have a relationship with Him, and I felt for the time being that I'll just go to Bible college.
Of course.
Yeah. And I thought, well, I should get to know my God more and understand His Word. And in my 12 months, my first 12 months at Bible college, I had so many people spoke over me. They didn't know my circumstance necessarily, but they all said things like, you will be used by God. You're an incredible person. God has gifted you. You are a leader. And I had prophets say to me, you're a vessel that God's going to use all the time, that He's pleased with, that He's loved. And I had promises from the Bible for myself where, that the enemy didn't come to kill, steal, and destroy, but Jesus came to give me life. And to be fair, at the time, I just didn't feel like my circumstances kind of matched that, the picture of my life at the time. I mean, I was raised by a single mum, broken home, raised in a refugee camp, and didn't finish year 12. I didn't feel like I was that person that God would go, I'm going to readily use you. yeah.
So you're in these circumstances where you feel like, they're out of your control in some ways, but God's spoken this promise to you. And at the time you're looking at everything that you're living through and you're going, how is this possible? How have you seen God's promises for you at work? Because I think many of us this morning at the moment, we're in this space where we feel God's spoken words of hope and promise to us, but the circumstances like yours look far from the the word that God's given us. Tell us how that's outworked in your life.
Yeah, well, I didn't laugh at God like Abraham and Sarah did, but I certainly questioned. But I think for me, it just took me a little while to believe that God is the one that gave me the promise and spoken by other people, and then He surrounded me with people that to encourage me, which is wonderful. But I think for the first time I felt really relieved that my only person that I need to not even impress but to follow and love is God. And then from there, I could do anything like He said I could. So I have. And I think I just took a step at a time in obedience. And I'm married with 3 kids, and they're wonderful. You met the boys this morning.
Great artists.
Yeah, they really are. They don't know who Picasso is yet, but but they are great. They're great artists. Yeah. And I just took a step at a time. I went back and finished year 12 as an adult. I finished Bible college, became a youth worker. I worked as a chaplain in youth work in school from P to 12, and felt like I gave meaning and purpose to helping young people and their families journey through life. I get the opportunity to lead many short-term mission teams in the past 20 years. Felt like I had something to give there, where I could take people on a journey to get their world expanded. And now I get to do what I do here at GMS, and to champion students who have come through and just really dedicating their year to follow God. So I feel like, for me, the promise is there, but it's also just taking one step at a time and just trusting the person. So my encouragement would be to, despite what your circumstance may say to you, if God has given you a promise, and He has given us many through His word too, or to you directly, then I think hold on to that and just take one step at a time.
Yeah, that's really great. Would you thank Sav for me? Thanks, Sav. It's like Sarah. Sav found herself in difficult circumstances, and God speaks this word to her that just doesn't make sense if she looked at the earthly circumstances that she was in. But Sav showed incredible trust and faith in God and the promise and the word that He spoke to her. And Sav, in my eyes, you are a legend of the faith, because an ordinary woman like you, God has chosen, and He is doing incredible things in and through you. And I love that about Sav's story. It's not the end of the promise, but it keeps on going. And that's the same for the rest of us this morning. That just like Sav and just like Sarah, there's no expiry date on God's promises. Sarah was 90 when she gave birth to a son. Her husband was as good as dead. There is no expiry dates on God's promises. I want to have a quick look at a timeline just to help you get some perspective in this story, because I am jumping around a little bit. But Abraham was 75 when God first told him that he was going to be the father of a great nation with many descendants. 10 years go by and still there's nothing. So Sarah, in her wisdom, offers Abraham her maidservant Hagar, thinking that God's promise needs a little bit of a helping hand from her because nothing has happened. He's 86 when Ishmael is born. When Abraham is 99, the Lord comes to him again and tells him that Sarah will give him a baby within a year. And then a year later, Abraham is 100 and Sarah is 90 when she gives birth to Isaac. But Abraham and Sarah's promise is 25 years in the making. And it kept going for generations afterwards. But that's a long period of waiting for a promise to be fulfilled. And some of you, I know, are in a period of waiting. And some of you, I know, have waited even longer to see God fulfill some of the promises that He's spoken to you. Like salve, yours might be a work in progress as you learn to continually trust God and his faithfulness to the promises he's given you. Or maybe you've been waiting so long that you feel like God's promise for you has expired. You know, we live in a world where everything expires. Everything runs out. Everything comes to an end. In fact, the contents of our pantry are full of items that are past their use-by dates. And no judgment this morning, because I know that many of you will have these kind of items in your pantry as well. Sushi sauce. This was a bit of a fad that I went through. 2005 expiry date. It was a very short-lived fad. That one could have even come up with us from Sydney for all I know at that date. Carnation milk. Who has carnation milk in their pantry? Hands up. What do you even do with this stuff? I reckon I keep buying it and replacing it because my mum always had it in her pantry. I have never used it and don't even know what to do with it. That one's 2012 though, so it's not too bad. Bit of beef stock. I'm actually embarrassed that I found this in my pantry. 2013. Not too bad. Anyway, that one's not getting used either. But unlike the expiry dates on my food, which have become useless because I've left them too long to use, God's promises don't expire. Just because I can no longer safely use my sushi sauce doesn't mean that God won't fulfill his promises, even when it seems to be taking an awful long time. Sometimes God's promises take longer to fulfill than we think they should. God's promise to Abraham and Sarah certainly took longer than they thought that it should. Sarah was well and truly past her childbearing expiry date. Abraham, as we saw on the timeline, was already 75 when God first spoke this promise to him in Genesis 12. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. What an incredible blessing and promise to be given by God. And with God's promise came a plan, because when God gives us a promise, he always has a plan. His first step in the plan was this: go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. So Abraham faithfully went, took all his household, all his family, and he went. And they waited. And they waited. And nothing seemed to be happening. See, God makes this enormous promise to Abraham, and for 10 years, nothing happened. It must have been hard for them in that waiting period. They certainly weren't getting any younger. What was God doing? Many of us find ourselves in periods of waiting for God's promise to be fulfilled in our lives. You may have heard a whisper from God to you at some point, a purpose, a dream, a vision, or a promise for your life. But like Abraham and Sarah, you're still waiting to see the fulfillment of that promise. Or you may be worried that God's promise for you has expired. You've missed out. It's too late. We're not used to waiting. We want instant answers to our text messages. We want the fastest queue at the checkout. We want fast food. We want faster internet, quicker traffic, an instant weight loss pill, more money for less effort. We live in a society that is losing the art of waiting, and we get impatient. And after 10 years of waiting, Sarah got impatient. She got impatient and stepped outside of God's plan. what she soon realised was that there are no substitutes for God's promises. See, Sarah got impatient waiting for God's plan to unfold, so she decided she would take things into her own hands. You see, Sarah believed God's promise to Abraham. She believed that God would give him children and that he would be the father of a great nation. She just didn't believe it could happen through her. So after 10 years of waiting for the promise to be fulfilled, she lost faith that this promise could happen through her. Circumstances looked impossible from her perspective. She would have been around 75 years old herself at this stage, and she was already way past her childbearing years. Like many of us, her perspective was limited by her own understanding and what she could see. So in faith, believing God's promise, she offered her maidservant, Hagar, to Abraham in Genesis 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." You can tell right from the beginning this is fraught with danger, can't you? And Abraham agreed to what Sarai said. Like I said, fraught with danger. So after Abram had been living in Canaan for 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. See, solving the problem her own way didn't work out quite how Sarah had expected it to. In fact, by stepping outside of God's plan, others got hurt. See, God's plan never contradicts his character as revealed in his word. So Sarah ended up suffering from shame and the guilt of having stepped outside of God's plan. And then she put that hurt and frustration onto Abraham. And worst of all was the pain that Hagar endured because of the shame and then the mistreatment by Sarah. When we step outside the plans God has for us and for our lives, people get hurt. You might be experiencing hurt and shame today because you've stepped outside God's plans for your life. Words that you've spoken in anger has hurt someone you care about. A friendship that's been lost through betrayal. You've gotten your family into huge debt because you couldn't control your spending. Maybe someone you love has stepped outside the plan and you've been caught in the crossfire. Maybe a friend or a business partner has betrayed your trust. Maybe your kids have stepped outside the plans God has for their life. Worse still, maybe your marriage partner has stepped outside the plans that God has for your marriage. When somebody steps outside God's plans, people get hurt. But what I love about the character of God that we see here in this story of Sarah is that even when we get impatient, even when we step outside of God's plan, even when we stuff up and we hurt other people in the process, God is still gracious. He's still gracious to fulfill his plan, and he invites us back into his story. See, Sarah and Abraham's failure wasn't fatal. And I reckon some of you here this morning need to hear this too. Your failure isn't fatal. God's grace is enough for all of us. See, when we look at this story, God showed incredible grace to Hagar, who was the victim in the story. In Genesis 16, he says to Hagar, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai," she answered, in that voice too. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." Incredible blessing for Hagar after the pain that she suffered at the hands of Sarah. And God showed incredible grace to Sarah, even after all the pain and hurt that she'd caused. Despite the circumstances, despite them stepping outside of God's plan, God kept his promise to Abraham and Sarah. This ordinary woman who blundered her way through, who allowed her faith to be limited by her circumstances, who took things into her own hands. This ordinary woman, this ordinary person like you and me, God used to do something quite extraordinary. Through her, God birthed a nation. Genesis 21, now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. He was true to his promise. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the very time God had promised. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." And she added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." Incredible joy that came with the fulfillment of this promise. A promise that was 25 years in the making. God was faithful to his promise to Sarah and Abraham, even when they doubted because of their circumstances. God kept his promise. Even when Sarah got tired of waiting and stepped outside of God's plan, he was faithful. Even though there were many years of waiting between the promise and the fulfillment, God was faithful. Even when you can't see a way forward, hear this morning. God is faithful. Even when your circumstances don't make sense, God is faithful. Even when someone else gets hurt because of the choices that you've made, God is faithful. He's faithful in every circumstance, every season of your life. No matter what you are going through right now, God is faithful because his character doesn't change. Just as he was faithful to Abraham and Sarah, he will be faithful to you. Don't give up hope. Be faithful and wait for God's promises to be fulfilled. Be faithful to God and his word. Be faithful to God's plan. As we look at the honour Sarah received as a woman of faith, we see a God who loves to demonstrate his incredible grace and power through ordinary people. And I know this morning that God wants to bless you as well, because I see the heart of God in this story to bless. And just as he poured out his grace and his healing and his blessing over Sarah and Abraham, Hagar and Ishmael, he wants to pour it out over you, because God's character never contradicts his word. You know, we have a beautiful gift this morning for all the women this morning, because this story, this reminder is for all of us. But this morning being Mother's Day, we want to bless the women of our church, whether you are a mother or not in the biological sense. says, I will bless her. I will bless her. And I want you to take this as a reminder that God's promises are for you, that He is faithful no matter what the circumstances and no matter what waiting you have to do. He is faithful and He will bless you. This morning, I want to pray a blessing over every single woman who is here this morning. I wonder if every woman, that means if you're not a man, every woman, stand up right now, please. Every woman across this place, I want to pray a blessing over you, over your life, over your ministry, over the other women that you walk alongside and you bless just by being the woman that God called you to be. See, as women, we carry half of God's character. We carry half of His character. We are all made in the image of God, male and female. And this morning I want to bless all you women. Now, all you blokes, find a woman around you, lay hands on them appropriately if they're not your partner or mother. But let's bless the women in our church this morning. Make sure there is somebody with somebody. No, that's just going to get awkward. Just lay hands on them, stretch out your arms, whatever. We have a lot of women here this morning. This is awesome. Awesome. Let's pray. God, I thank you for the women in this church. God, I thank you for every single woman here this morning. God, I thank you that they are your image bearers, that they carry your heart. They carry your love. They carry so many incredible promises that you have spoken to your people. God, I pray this morning that you would help each and every one of them to be faithful in the waiting. Whatever their circumstances right now, God, whatever the promises that you've spoken to them, God, would you give them the courage and the strength to be faithful in the waiting. And God, I pray this morning where there is pain, God, you know and you see. God, I thank you for your incredible healing power, your power and your grace that brings healing to the pain that we feel in our hearts and the physical pain that we carry. But God, I pray most of all this morning that you would fill each and every one of us with hope for the future. God, that we wouldn't allow our future to be limited by what we see in our circumstances right now. But God, we would see you as the incredible God who speaks incredible promise over us and over our lives, who can do immeasurably more than we can ask or imagine according to the power that lives within us. God, I pray that you would help each and every woman here this morning to expect more from you, because that is who you are. Your character doesn't contradict your word. You are a God who loves to bless. I pray that your blessing would pour out over us this morning, over these beautiful women, as they continue to be your image bearers. Thank you for them. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Why don't everybody stand? We're going to sing a song right now that talks about the incredible, steadfast love of God. And whether you're a male or a female this morning, you might be really struggling to feel God's love. You might be struggling to feel His promises in the circumstances that you're in right now. And you want somebody to come alongside you, to stand with you and pray with you. I'm going to invite our prayer team to come down the front right now, please. Right now. Because we walk through some difficult times, whether we're mums or dads or young people, single, old. We walk through these circumstances and we find it so hard sometimes to see God. We find it so hard to hear the promises that He's speaking over us. We carry pain in our heart for lots of different reasons, and hope for the future, hope in God and who He says He is really hard right here in the circumstances, because this becomes so overwhelming. You know, as part of a family here This is what family does. We stand alongside each other. We help hold each other up in the times that we are struggling. I just want to encourage you. We have an incredible prayer team down here this morning, and if that's you, if you want somebody just to stand alongside you, help hold your arms up, help give you the strength, maybe some insight to speak God's promises and blessing over you this morning, can I encourage you right now as we sing this song, come down the front, receive prayer. We're doing this together, family. We're doing it together. Be blessed this morning. Have a great day.
We hope you've been blessed by this message. If you've made a decision to follow Christ or would like us to pray for you, please go to gatewaybaptist.com.au and let us know.